So welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. My name is Oliver Walton from Department of Social Policy Sciences at the University of Bath. And this webinar is entitled Crisis and Intersectional Justice in Lebanon and Sri Lanka. And it marks the launch of a small comparative project, which we're conducting with colleagues from University of Bath in the UK, the Centre for Poverty Analysis in Sri Lanka, and the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. And the project is examining the role of organizations representing women and sexual minorities in the recent protest movements in these two countries. Before we get started, I think just to kind of remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded. So if you don't want to feature on camera, just, I guess, keep your camera switched off. I'm just going to give a little bit of background very briefly, and then we'll hand over to our two speakers, Waradas Thiyagaraja and Lina Abou-Habib. And they're each going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. So hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion. And since we're just launching this project, we are very keen to hear from you and to hear your suggestions and comments and things that we should be considering in this project. So the project is funded by GCRF via the MENASP network, and the specific call that the project responded to was focused on the connections between social protection, social policy and conflict in the MENA region, but beyond the MENA region as well. And essentially what we are trying to address in this project is we're looking at how struggles over social protection are negotiated by marginalized groups in post-war societies. One of the reasons that we wanted to focus on Lebanon and Sri Lanka is because both of these countries have faced severe political and economic crises in recent years. And in both countries, we've seen large-scale and quite sustained protest movements emerging in response to those crises. In both cases triggered by a similar mix of factors relating to corruption, lack of political accountability, issues around the cost of living, absence of basic public services. And in both cases, these protest movements have led to significant political changes, including the resignation of leading political figures. We see that women and sexual minorities have in many ways borne the brunt of these crises, and organizations representing those groups have also played a really important role in these wider protest movements. So in this project, we're trying to explore how the crisis has been experienced by women and sexual minorities. We're also interested in how these groups have then responded to the crisis, how these groups have shaped and negotiated relations with wider protest movements, and then thinking about what the consequences of that have been for those wider movements and for questions around intersectional justice. So, yeah, we're very pleased to welcome our two speakers for today. First of all, we have Lina Abou-Habib, who's the Gender Director of the Asfari Institute at the American University of Beirut. She's worked actively linking the women's movement in Lebanon to sister activists in the region and abroad, as well as contributing to shaping the feminist public struggles related to women's rights. And Waradas Thiyagaraja is a lecturer in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at the University of Bath. He's a peace and conflict studies scholar. And his research focuses particularly on the intersection between sexual and gender justice movements and armed conflict and post-war transitions. He also worked as an activist, organizing marginalized segments of the queer community in Sri Lanka with the effort to decentralize the sexual and gender justice landscape. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Lina, who's going to talk, and then that will be followed by Vara, and then we will collect questions. So please do post your questions in the chat or your comments as the speakers are speaking. So yeah, over to you, Lina.
Thank you, Oliver, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Very happy that we're having this conversation to kick off the project, because this is indeed on the one hand, it's a very timely discussion and a very timely research. But on the other hand, we are not talking about a crisis that has just started or that is recent or contemporary. And that's why perhaps I want to start by saying that the multiple crises currently being witnessed in Lebanon have actually exacerbated existing vulnerabilities and inequalities and vulnerabilities that have existed way before, but have been, become more critical with the multiple crises witnessed right now. And it's very important, to start by looking at the context and understanding or recognizing the pre-existing conditions that were already there before the crisis. So on the one hand, a very discriminatory legal framework, a legal framework that is in the letter of the law very discriminatory, in its practice, in the interpretation, very discriminatory. A context where there is a very close interconnectedness between the religious and the political, and where these two reinforce each other at the expense of vulnerable groups, and where vulnerable groups actually pay the price of this unholy alliance. And of course, social and economic disparities have always existed, and what we keep seeing is an increase in these disparities for the reasons that I will discuss. One of which is an endemically dysfunctional public sector, endemically expensive because it does eat up quite a lot of our national budget, but at the same time endemically corrupt and endemically dysfunctional. And of course, not the least, the ways in which communities and societies are both in Lebanon, similarly as in the region as anywhere else, at the same time patriarchal and militarized. And I think the militarization of societies is the biggest elephant in the room that adds to this vulnerability and that actually also manipulates the crisis. And thinking or talking in 2024 again, if we want to complete this picture, we cannot forget or be oblivious to the fact that since the end of the civil war in Lebanon, impunity has prevailed. So there hasn't been, and talking about justice, there hasn't been a justice system that the country has worked with. I mean, no process of justice that we have worked with. And just to give you an example, Oliver and colleagues, it's only 2 years ago, when the war ended theoretically in 1990, only 2 years ago, we began to talk about rape during the Civil War. And it has been very cautious. It was sanitized. It was because it involved people or groups who are now in power and who have been in power since the end of the war. We add to this the absence of any useful, I might say, public and social policies that is pro-poor, pro-vulnerable, pro-women, and heaven forbid to say, pro-refugees or pro-queer, etc. A regular recurrence of political crises that are at the same time militarized crises. So basically a latent conflict that has not stopped since the official end of the war in the 1990s. Comes 2019, an attempt at an uprising, and I have to say perhaps a short-lived attempt at an uprising, followed immediately by a very poorly managed pandemic in the country, followed by one of the most acute economic crises, followed by the blast that happened in Beirut, the Beirut blast, followed now by a political stalemate, a complete bankruptcy, and then the war in Gaza and its repercussions on Lebanon. So all of this are actually, we really need to look at all of this to understand what is, where are the vulnerabilities and how are different groups, vulnerable groups, affected. And I will say here that I want to focus in the few remaining minutes on 4 vulnerable groups. Although, I really want to say that defining vulnerability in a context that is as problematic as this one is not fixed in time or space or, in terms of definition. These vulnerabilities are expanding, and these vulnerabilities are very much intersectional. They're not disconnected one from the other. And again, I want to insist on saying that these are vulnerabilities that have existed way before, that have been exacerbated now. I would talk first about migrant women domestic workers. I think everybody knows that this phenomena of the ways in which migrant women domestic workers have started to come to Lebanon during the civil war, and how this has expanded, and how this has been codified in what we call the sponsorship system, predates the crisis, and has exacerbated way before the crisis, and has benefited from a state of impunity even before the crisis. And I want to remind everybody that the provisions of the labor laws in Lebanon do not cover migrant women domestic workers or migrant workers in general. So basically, there's no legal recourse to all the abuses that have been systematically taking place from the start of, hosting migrant women domestic workers. What we have seen, and I just want to give two examples and then move to another topic. What we have seen as a result of the crisis, again, the combined crisis, we have seen an expansion of abusive practices against migrant women domestic workers. So the abusive practices before were within the confines of the private domain. So they were basically confiscating passports, harsh working conditions, long hours of work, no benefits whatsoever. We know all this, but also not paying wages or withholding wages. With the crisis, withholding of wages became a pattern rather than actually an occurrence in certain cases. Became a pattern because the employers found it justifiable, since their income has dropped, to basically take it out from their domestic workers, to the extent, and what we've seen is atrocious, and it was reported by many organizations. I would cite here and the anti-racism movement that is still doing an amazing job on this front. So basically, we've seen employers just basically driving their migrant workers and then throwing them in front of their consular services or embassies. Without passports, without anything, barely with the clothes on their that they were wearing, and just leaving them to their own devices. Just like people started dropping their house pets and their migrant workers on the street during the crisis. Just to give us an idea, and they didn't even bother to give them back their passports in many cases. But on the other hand, of course, I don't want to take time because we will be covering this also in the work that we will be doing. But on the other hand, and again, I want to refer you to a really interesting piece of work that our colleagues at the anti-racism movement have done, which is a scoping of all the mobilization of migrant women themselves. It's very difficult to fight the kafala system, given that it's protected by the police and it's protected by the legal framework, it's protected by law enforcement. But the solidarity action during the crisis was amazing in terms of, taking care of women who were thrown out of their employers, in terms of giving basic needs, particularly. I want to give the example of our colleagues in Jayitna, which is an organization that works on menstrual health and period poverty. So basically also to ensure that at least the basic needs related to menstrual health were met and sexual and reproductive health were met. So there was this organizations of women workers themselves, by community, I must add, but also by certain, and not many, women or feminist organizations like Jayitna to collaborate on particular needs. The other community which is interesting for us, the other kind of mobilization which is interesting for us, I still have 2 minutes, I'll close in 2 minutes, Oliver, is actually in terms of the queer community with its diversity. And here, Okay, and here it's very important to look at the additional invisibility and non-recognition of the queer community as a community that exists, that has the right to exist. So obviously, when we had the big explosion in the Beirut port, one of the most devastated areas was an area that was a safe haven for the queer community, for sex workers, for migrant workers, etc., which of course the state did not recognize or did not bother about. And I want to refer you here to an amazing solidarity initiative that was put together by queer groups, by organization that existed before the crisis, but they were queer-led organization, which created an initiative called Yalla Care. Yalla means let's go in Arabic. And that initiative, Oliver, is first of all created a database, mobilized actually created a database, did an assessment of the destruction in livelihoods and in lives amongst the queer community, and rolled out themselves a plan to basically support people in terms of shelter, in terms of food. Many people lost their livelihoods, and we have to remember that this was a safe space. So it wasn't possible for somebody to go get a job elsewhere. This was a carefully nurtured safe space that had become a safe haven for everybody, and which from one day to the other basically was destroyed. And if I'm allowed just to add one last concern for us, which I'm hoping also we will look at, is basically the forcibly displaced, whether in Lebanon, and which again, it's important to understand that it's not a homogeneous community. It's a displacement is a status. It doesn't mean that, or refugee is a status, doesn't mean that everybody is similar. And the fact that everybody is not the same means that the impact, that the vulnerabilities are not the same, and the impact is different. So the impact of this crisis on those who have been historically in a refugee situation, mainly Palestinians, has been, and where there is an established entity, well, we have to see if it will continue, UNRWA, an established entity that would provide health and education and also employment. That is one entity with a different kind of indicators of vulnerability versus the refugees from Syria, where the demographics are different, and where also the responsibility and the voice of these communities is actually way more compromised. So what happened at these levels? First of all, this is where I want to add the other layer, and then I promise I will stop in a moment, which is the layer related to racism and hate speech against refugees in general. So when the COVID crisis pandemic hit, we had actually political statement made by politicians saying that the vaccines that Lebanon received are only for Lebanese and not for the refugees. So basically, access to the vaccine, which was a basic right, was not considered even a possibility to discuss. Of course, the mobilization and work by different aspects of Lebanese civil society, but also by the international donors who gave Lebanon the vaccine, changed this situation. But just to say that if you look at, and that would be my final thing, what is interesting now is to look now in 2024 with the increasing complexities of the crisis, and with the realization that all of these crises are now, we can definitely consider them as protracted. They are going to continue in the future with emerging political crises such as the forced return, what we're seeing about the forced return of Syrian refugees, etc. The most interesting thing for us is to look at comparatively at the ways in which these crises are actually increasing these vulnerabilities and pushing in a way that these vulnerabilities might become irreversible or might get to a stage where they are serious threats on lives and livelihoods. Thank you so much. And I've basically took 3 more minutes or 4 more minutes.
That's okay. No, thank you so much, Lina. That was gives a really rich overview. So yeah, I'll hand over now to Vera.
Oliver, am I audible?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, thanks for organizing this and inviting me. And Lina made my job pretty much easier so that I don't have to run into the whole, repeating those contextual things and whatnot. So I'll focus on the role of queer community in the, recent crisis in Sri Lanka. So that gives a bit of a different lens. As Lina said, there's no one crisis. Sri Lanka by no means an exception for this situation. So we've been running through a number of waves of crisis since I think 2017, and then first in 2018 with the 52 days of constitutional coup, and then in 2019 Easter bombings and the regime change, and then COVID, and then economic crisis afterward. Yeah, from a I think from a very much of a victim-centered perspective, I think we would all agree that queer community would be one of the worst affected segments of the society at all. Any crisis, occurs in a society. Like as Lina said, there is, those already existing inequalities become, further intensified and, made it more normal and, legitimized further with all the crisis escalating. We have had people, who lost their jobs overnight. We've had people who lost their, homes overnight. We have had people who being, exposed to prosecution. We've had queer community members who finally resort to sex work to, support their daily expenses. All sort of things were happening, and then, in the larger collective organizing sector, and there was also sense of self-censorship. When every time there's a crisis, keep a low profile and, try to save your work, and then, make sure that you don't, become a target of state-sponsored queerphobic attack. The unholy alliance between conservative religion segments and, the state and the politicians, all those things. That was the case. I mean, when it hit us in 2018 in Sri Lanka first, when temporarily or briefly former President Rajapaksa was reinstated as 52 days of prime minister, right? So it gives a bit of a red flag for the queer communities, just to keep low profile. But it didn't stop there, so on the victim front. But on the other hand, it was not always, the case of, being, silence or being silenced by the state. It was also a case of exploiting some of those how do you say surprising opportunities, and responding to the momentum is also the reality of queer communities during crisis time. So for example, when 2018 November, President Sirisena made this infamous butterfly speech, referring to former prime minister, the now current president, decision-making style is a more of an irresponsible, flamboyant leadership, which obviously linked to a queerphobic slur called butterfly in local language in Sinhalese. Queer communities took it to the street and, joined with all the other collective mobilizing forces and for democracy, and made it an opportunity where they can, so mainstream queer agenda in the democratization process. So, and then this wave, gave a bit of a hope for queer, agency in the context of crisis. And then when we hit by COVID, again, going back to, all the essential things, and, if you wanted to talk about, access to, social safety network, and, all the supports that provided by a government, the invisibilization of queer subjectivities, or the existence of queer, made literally impossible to access whatever the meager support that was provided by the government during COVID. We've had people who didn't have a registration of residency, so you can't access whatever the money, cash grant given by the government because you don't have documents. And we've had elections during this time after Easter bombing in 2019. We've had queer community members who couldn't vote in elections because they don't have electoral registry, right? All sort of those issues were there. And then it was also a situation where queer communities be collectively targeted for, electoral propaganda, and also, legitimizing the state in different ways. And then even during crisis, there was a emergency regulation passed by current president when he took over prime ministership during the economic crisis, that intensify punishments for certain crimes, which also included homosexuality, and then which was later withdrawn after civil society's outroar. And then one of the interesting things that happened during this process of crisis is that queer community, because they have now been exposed to organizing themselves in parallel to, or along with the other democratic movements in 2018 with the October coup, felt very much, in a way comfortable, or in a way, empowered to work with the, Aragalaya uprising, which led to the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the installation of current interim president. And then the two key things that happened in this process. One thing is that, queer community worked hand in hand with the other civil and democratic forces to negotiate the transition. And then the second thing that happened in that process is that negotiating the space within the dissent movement is also another important element that took place, because there had been accusation about sexual harassment even within the, civil society groups that were part of the collective mobilization. And then particularly for trans women, when we were occupying the presidential secretariat area and all the Gota Gogama. And then there was a need for creating an equality shelter for queer people to, feel there's a safe spot for them. So that's, the culmination of equality shelter is a symbolic act of, how queer community negotiated their, even the including physical space with the movement. And it was not an easy negotiation, to be honest. And there were a lot of, internal tensions. But I would like to say one more thing, so that I can give more time for discussion, is that, when we talk about, marginalized communities in context of crisis, one thing that, often been overlooked, the sheer heterogeneity of this community. So these are not, homogeneous communities when we talk about, their contribution. So then the question arises, what was the driving force behind queer community taking leadership in, coming together in an extremely volatile situation, and, putting themselves at risk, giving up their self-censorship role, and then taking up, taking it to the streets. Initially, it was, the larger, the Sri Lanka's queer movement basically in the initial 2 decades is very much confined and identified with the liberal civil society NGO space, right? And then what happened towards the latter stages, like in late around 2015, and then late, early 2020s, the growth of queer left became quite a significant characteristics of the queer movement. That a group or the space that was growing out in between, I would say, like, a space that was negotiating a space between the liberal NGO space and also, the other, the space that traditionally occupied by left forces. For example, trade unions and, non-NGO-sized groups working for human rights and other social and economic justice issues. So this particular dynamic played a significant role in terms of bringing queer community as a collective force in the whole crisis situation. So, for example, in the Butterfly for Democracy movement, the initial press conference was called by mainly queer individuals who were basically working with the queer left or liberal segments, and then it created the it motivated other LGBT NGOs, more queer liberal, homo liberal and capitalist segments to also join the activities later on, which led to the Butterfly for Democracy movement. Similar pattern followed in the Aragalaya as well. When Aragalaya started, it was basically LGBT folks from the rural urban areas who wanted to do something and work with, more organized fashion with the protest movement, and where all the LGBT NGOs, majority of the LGBT NGOs, took a step back and didn't even support the whole queer organizing in the Aragalaya. So it was basically young trans rural queer folks played a pioneering role in organizing Aragalaya, which opened up a really interesting space with the establishment of Equality Shelter, and also the organizing of Aragalaya Pride in 2022, which was Sri Lanka's one of the first Pride marches with huge, massive participation. It gave a hope for queer folk to mainstream their grievances, and also the idea of bringing in collective agency into mainstream political discussions beyond the NGO space. So one might wonder, okay, so there were all these positive things happening along the side Aragalaya for queer community. What has happened to them maybe after Aragalaya, after the sabotage against forces that worked in Aragalaya? Well, sadly enough, economic reality is not going to go away simply because we are part of Aragalaya. It's going to get hit harder than ever, with the inaccessibility to all social security networks and Asfari and all the other provisions. So what happened? Most of the leaders who were queer leaders who were part of Aragalaya, right, had to be sort of had to negotiate their post Aragalaya sort of engagement and livelihood, and most of them got absorbed into NGO work, LGBT NGO work. So most of them end up working for LGBT NGOs as a means of providing themselves through this turbulent time. And some of them actually left the country, and then there are a few key people who still continue to work in those spaces. And another interesting element that happened is also because the queer agenda became quite visible and became normalized within the collective mobilization process. Nationalist forces, particularly, nationalist forces with Gotabaya Rajapaksa's regime, who's in the Gotabaya Rajapaksa, also saw this as some kind of an opportunity for them to engage with queer community, and then which resulted in a backbencher of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government bringing in the decriminalization bill as a private member bill to the parliament. And an interesting thing happened. The LGBT NGOs that refused to be part of Aragalaya initially did not hesitate to join this bandwagon. They immediately joined that whole process, started engaging with the SLPP member, and shed more optimism around that. But we yet to see an outcome of that bill, which is now stuck at the Ministry of Justice and some of the Parliamentary Legislative Committee. But I will make this last point and stop here. But throughout this period, there was one thing that was consistent in terms of queer identity and queer representation in political space, is that the approach of left parties in addressing queer issues, particularly the popular one, NPP, National People's Power, led by Andrew Kumara, tend to maintain their consistent approach since 2018, that is to say that they will decriminalize homosexuality and then also address some of the socio-economic issues that are affecting queer community in the long run. But that we'll have to wait and see how it's going to happen. So this is sort of a very patchy some information that I wanted to share with you guys, and then maybe when you guys have a lot of questions, I should be able to elaborate a little more. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bara. Yeah, it's great to open up the question about how queer organizations can, take these opportunities of crisis, even though there's still many constraints that remain there. So I think now, we can open it up for questions. So people, please feel free to raise your hand and speak, or you can post questions in the chat. So we already have a question for Lina from Arjun Dahan, which is, can you see the question, Lina? Do you want me to? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, well, first of all, I'm very happy to hear from Ariane, and it's a very interesting question indeed. Yes, it's definitely, it's no secret to anybody. It's a collapse, it's a bankruptcy, but it's also a grand robbery. So, everything is there. In answering your question, Ariane, I just want to refer to a study that my colleague did last year. And it was last year was a time when the government was in this process of flirting with the IMF. Of course, it didn't go anywhere, but it was so bad that we got to a point where even the IMF would be a good possibility. It was that it had reached that low. And my colleague Sarah Al-Boueri did a fantastic research delving into the potential results of the gendered implication on education of a potential adoption of austerity measures by the IMF. Of course, it was a great piece of work that basically the intention was to spoon feed the government the arguments, the data, the analysis, at least looking at education. This didn't go anywhere because these conversations, the negotiations with the IMF didn't go anywhere. Probably didn't even start. But in answering your question, we cannot at all expect any modality of the current government or whatever government will follow. It would be foolish from us to expect that they would be looking at social justice in general, let alone intersectional justice. So there's absolutely no expectation from their part for a number of reasons, which maybe we can talk about it later. And I think the only possibility is basically to work with. And again, it's bad that we have come to this, but that's the only possibility, is to work with serious international partners and work with them on conditionalities. And I'm really using the word serious international partners because we have seen throughout the last few decades that it's not just our governments, it's actually the actors in the international community who are not really who are not really serious about commitments to intersectional vulnerabilities, seriously to social justice. It's uneven in this regard. But still, I would say that And this is basically the idea of the global advocacy and the international advocacy that some of us are engaged with. It's truly because the structures of the consecutive governments show no sign of being of interest or commitment to social justice issue. And on the other hand, I mean, an international community that allows a genocide to take place is also not incredibly reliable. But you know, so it isn't. I don't want to say. I don't want to deal with this as if it's hopeless and a dead end. But I would say putting our efforts towards conditionality of rebuilding fiscal resources and who would be the actor engaged in rebuilding these fiscal resources if they are ever going to be rebuilt. That's the entry point for looking. That's the entry point for looking at the potential for taking into consideration intersectional vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to ask a question for Lina or Vara?
Can I just add something, Oliver?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. I want to add another layer, and it's probably because it's not just related to Lebanon or even the Swana region. And I'm sure Wara, our colleague, might have seen similarities. But I think we cannot also not take into consideration the violent rise of the anti-rights movements. And by anti-rights, it's anti-queer, anti-abortion, anti-refugees, anti-everything. And from where I am in Lebanon, during the last 2 years, the anti-rights movement have been particularly vocal and particularly hostile. We have seen it in most parts of Lebanon. People have been named. People have been named. A target has been put on them. The Secretary General of Hezbollah has clearly said that, given before Gaza, he gave clear instructions to extract, and I'm using the exact, to extract these deviant elements from our societies. So in a way, truly diverting the attention of people into what is destroying our otherwise perfect communities and families, and distracting people from the fact that actually the serious problems in these communities are elsewhere. They're with corruption, increased poverty, absence of employment, discrimination, etc. So and also the fact that we have no significant social protection policies that would at least help people not to die from hunger. So not to be it might look like a conspiracy theory, but everywhere we are and everywhere we deal with activists, etc., we see the same strategies of the anti-rights movements, and we need to think about the ways in which this goes hand in hand with this trend of increased corruption, increased destruction of public institutions, and basically the disintegration of quality of life.
Thanks, Lina. Yeah, and Vara may have further reflections on that point, but there's also just a new question in the chat from Timindri. So she's saying, can we hear your thoughts on how the state seems to be using new policy and legal measures to subjugate the causes of the movement while making it seem like it's a response to the movement? Vara, did you have any thoughts on that?
Okay, I think it's an interesting question. I can talk about the decriminalization bill again. So I think it's what happened with the crisis back home is that particularly with regard to queer agenda, right? It started to get more and more legitimacy within the rights movement and also the protest movement increasingly, along with another issue that is the issues around social and economic justice issues. So a regime that is desperate to remain in power, a regime that is desperate to capitalize on any of these issues, it would have one might see it's much more easy a target to have pick up on some of those tokenistic issues to make it look much better than while they're doing all the crappy things. For example, online safety bill, sabotaging all the activists, arresting and anti-terrorism measures and all sort of things while we're going on, and then also dismantling the entire safety network or welfare networks that country whatever had before COVID. So I guess I think I also mentioned about this in another forum, the effort to pinkwash the whole brutal measures that have been taking place, right? It was surprising, to look at, and listen to what happened particularly in the North and East queer communities, where there's more issues around, pressing issues around, livelihood issues, access to basic needs is quite, pressing. They don't even have the, NGO ecosystem where they can, get a job and, make a living. Also, they don't even have the the more urban ecosystem where they could also effectively engage in sex work, right? So the desperation is quite prevalent in those pockets of queer organizing. So, but these social and economic justice issues are not necessarily part of the agenda, right? And this the struggling regime is trying to somehow maintain its legitimacy, not I don't know. So I think it's around it has become a catchy thing to talk about giving certain rights while completely dismantling the ecosystem where those rights can be effectively exercised, right? So there's no point in giving decriminalization if you are going to enact more regressive laws, if you are going to enact more regressive laws that restrict freedom of expression, that restrict freedom of association, that restrict the right to dissent and everything. And if you're completely dismantling the social welfare support that exists for state. And I was even more bit cynical about when I saw the IMF Sri Lanka branch started recruiting diversity fellows, particularly targeting LGBT folks, and while encouraging government to have extremely policies targeted toward austerity measures, and then how tokenistic that it looked like, so but then it cannot be generalized on the on the queer front also, because as I said, it's not a homogeneous entity. You see homo capitalist elements working closely with the current government, trying to bring in some of those changes, at least as minimal changes. But then I also would like to connect this question with Lina's last response to the question raised by, I think, Arjan in the chat box. Can we realistically expect anything better from, in terms of, intersectional justice if you are running into, these kind of economic crisis, and we have to if we have to manage macroeconomic situations with as she said, with the support of serious international partners. I think yes, that is a massive challenge. As for now, we don't see anything that's going to be substantial in the names of welfare, or making sure there's a safety net so that people don't have to peel the whatever the reforms that we implemented. But on the other hand, there can be some kind of ways of navigating that situation as well. So particularly looking at the a commitment that comes from traditionally left, but parties that are trying to amend their approach to power in Sri Lanka, is that taking some of those issues, particularly issues about abortion rights and issues about unpaid care work for women, and issues about education, and issues about LGBT rights and child rights, are taken quite seriously in those circles. But again, that is yet to be seen how it will get implemented, right? It's not an easy task. So that I understand that there is a temptation. There are certain measures, but it's also raised a suspicion whether this is something trying to pinkwash the whole ongoing repressive measures that have been taken by this government, because you cannot take it, look at it, as an individual act or instance, occurrence, or effort, but within the context of larger policy efforts taken by government to repress the freedom and rights. Yeah.
Thanks, Farah. Yeah, I see Lina, you have your hand, so please go ahead. Oh, sorry, you're muted, Lina.
Yes. Very quickly in answering our colleague on this question, in answering Tamindri, we're not even there yet, because the regimes in the region are unapologetic in terms of who they don't consider to be citizens or human being worthy of rights. So they're unapologetic about the laws that criminalize homosexuality, as they call it. They're unapologetic about the policies and the laws that discriminate against women, non-binary, refugees, etc. So we're not even there yet in terms of whitewashing anything. It's a system that is unapologetically oppressive, cruel, discriminatory, and is very clear. At least they're consistent and honest at this level, that they're very clear in remaining so. And that's why, as both activist and researcher, I see the power coming from, on the one hand, localized knowledge production, amplifying what people are doing, and on the other hand, lobbying and advocacy of actors on whom these regimes depend, because all the regimes in this region are dependent. I'm not, at least, the Middle East region, they are incredibly dependent, financially dependent in terms of their image, and dependent in terms of their positionality. So they're not even there yet in terms of trying to look better. So yeah, that was my answer to Tamindri.
Thanks, Lina. Yeah, that's really interesting contrast, I think, between the two. Yeah. So we have about 5 minutes. So there's time still if anyone else wanted to ask a question. If not, I could throw out a question. It's quite a big question, maybe for the 4 minutes remaining, but you've touched on it already in your presentations, but was just interested about, how do you sustain a movement in such difficult, economic and political times? So do you have any reflections in terms of the strategies and the approaches that different organizations or groups representing different communities have taken in terms of sustaining this, through such a series of crises that we've seen in both countries? So yeah, that's for both Lina and Vara, so whoever wants to go first.
It is a huge question, and I think it's a question that deserves a completely, a conversation. But I think, maybe I think what's important is to remember that we have limits, and maybe for some of us these limits have not been reached yet. And I think there's also and maybe it's with age, Oliver, that romanticizing the collective and romanticizing that it's maybe we need to and having expectations in terms of well, maybe we need to take a back seat and just reflect on the experiences, reflect on why was the October uprising so much short-lived. Yes, there was COVID and all of this, but why was it so short-lived? Why have so many left the countries in despair after 3 months? And why have so many basically jumped to become actors in the government? I mean, these are all questions, and of course there are reasons to despair. There are reasons to despair every day, and I think what keeps people going is maybe, I think it's basically their positionality and the choices that they have or that they don't have. This is what I mean by not perhaps for us just to be to have sobering reflections in terms of ourselves and what keeps us here and what keeps connecting us to this. So I don't know. I think just these are my immediate feelings and responses to your question, which again is a very important one.
Thank you, Lina. Vara, do you have any reflections?
Yeah, as Lina said, getting into streets may not necessarily, have a long life, especially if you are torn between number of, waves, different waves of crises, right? And but I think like the energy and the aspirations or the grievances that were, articulated during, those crises, need to be somehow get either absorbed by different political forces or different groups or work or spaces, or I guess, or it can manifest in different ways. So I, for example, I think Sri Lanka is heading for an election here this year or the early next year. So it would be interesting to see how some of these grievances and forces who are part of the crisis, shapes the electoral performance and outcomes. And on the other hand, there's also, effort to, engage and capitalize on this, outside of the electoral process, right? And organizing civic engagement and, continuing, the mobilizations and all sort of those things in different layers. So there's no definite answer in terms of how to sustain all these things. And then, forces working with the government, some may end up being part of the government, and so and then, as Lina said, many would probably leave the country. It's creating creating hope in this situation is an extremely political and difficult enterprise, because it's hope become very precarious practice. Even if you create hope, that become quite precarious practice than it used to be before the crisis either. Yeah, so I don't have a definite answer, but I see how it get absorbed and appropriated into different segments. Yeah.
Thank you, Vara. So I think we're at time now, unfortunately. But yeah, I want to just say a final thank you again to Lina and Vara for sharing their thoughts, and to everyone for coming along to the webinar. And also, just picking up on the comment from Gayatri, which is something for us to reflect on. And also, this crossed my mind as Lina was talking about, this research team in a way has some unique capabilities. So maybe picking up on the experience of Sri Lankan migrant workers in Lebanon would be an interesting thing to look at in going forward. So thank you for raising that, Gayatri. But thanks again, everyone. And the recording of this webinar also will be available online afterwards on the MENASP, from the MENASP website. So thanks again, everyone, for coming along.